Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm all right. Thank you. Nice to see you. Good to be with you.
Thank you for accepting and joining. I know you've had a busy day so far.
It's we have a couple job searches underway at the seminary, and that's always a grueling, a fascinating project or process to be a part of, but it's also painful because you see all of these wonderful people who you can't offer a job to. But anyway, that's my issue on my heart right now. Mm-hmm.
How was your Easter?
It was lovely. Thank you very much. Yes. We were able to get together with family because both my wife and I have been vaccinated, and my parents have also been vaccinated.
Mm-hmm.
So we felt safe having a small group together for dinner, which was just a joy. I mean, after so much separation, it was great to be together in person.
It's been over a year now, so I think everyone's feeling the same. But I
Yes.
think US is one of the countries which has got the best, the fastest vaccination program in place. So that's exciting.
Amen.
You, at least.
Yes, exactly. I feel grateful for that, while also hoping that there's equity and fairness and rapid distributions of vaccines around the globe.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, hopefully. I mean, as UK, we're kind of getting there, but it's I think we're half as quick as the US is.
Yeah, maybe. And Ramadan Mubarak to you, by the way, as well, and,
yes.
and to everyone who's listening in.
Yes, thank you. We in the UK, we just our Ramadan began 9 minutes ago. So it's excited to begin it with this, then hopefully turn to more religious obligations afterwards. But yeah, it's nice that Easter and Ramadan came together in kind of like a similar timing.
Yes.
Yeah,
I agree.
It's a pleasure to have you here. I mean, I read your book several back now. I think it was probably towards the end of last summer. And our book club at the Center for Hizmet Studies was initially done with just friends, and we weren't doing it live. But we thought that we're having these discussions and we could put it on a live platform, and then if anyone else wanted to join in, it would just be a plus. So that's how we started, really. So we had actually read your book and discussed it in private, but I don't know how many we've done so far. I think I've lost a lot. I wanted to discuss your book again. So I mean, I'm just going to look through the notes that I've got, and I think it would be best to start by introducing you as an academic and a Lutheran religious leader in the US. And something that I find interesting about you and when you started to write the book, or perhaps the process afterwards, is the fact that you didn't meet Gulen whilst writing the book. Despite, I'm sure you would have been offered the opportunity, and if you had asked, it would have been made available. But I think that's interesting for you to not meet him before writing the book, and then finishing that copy later on. I mean, this can kind of bring in some questions that I think came up in our discussion on, and I know you do go to Turkey, and you mentioned that in your book as well for some of your research. But why did you have this conscious decision on not meeting Gulen until you were done with the book? So start with that.
That's a wonderful place to start, actually. Methodologically, it was important for me to be balanced and as objective as possible. I had many people who were very close to Mr. Gülen and who were inspired by Mr. Gülen in my conversation patterns, and I had regular conversations with people close to Mr. Gülen. I did not have as many objective and or critical voices, and so I really wanted to bring some balance to my research, keeping an eye on the things that critics were writing and saying, while also, of course, paying close attention to the friends of Mr. Gulen as well, so that I could sift the evidence with a degree of objectivity. I had heard stories about people meeting Mr. Gulen for the first time who were overwhelmed by his charisma and his generosity and, the depth of his thought. I thought I could probably negotiate that okay, but I really wanted to get an entire draft of the book done before I sat down with him, and that was my method then, was that I was able then to ask him very specific and focused questions. So I didn't have to cover ground that other researchers had already recovered. I was able to focus on questions that were very specific to the research that I had done. And I'm happy to say that my personal encounters with him and the 2 90-minute interviews that we did reinforced what I saw in the evidence, namely that he is a very thoughtful, gentle man who has an extraordinary vision for bettering our world and putting Islam into practice in very dynamic ways in the modern world. So it was good to meet him. It was a risk I took because what if I've done all of this research and all of a sudden I don't like this guy, But that did not happen at all. We had a very gracious meeting. He was very patient with me, and I think we came away appreciating one another. And I certainly, had reinforced the impressions that I received from the literature and from the interviews that I did about him. And my apologies, my dog is barking outside right now, but that's going to happen if a UPS truck goes by or the mailman shows up or something like that. The dog will bark, but I appreciate your patience.
That's fine. Thank you very much for kind of touching upon, why you decided. And I think it is in your book where you do mention, where you're first introduced to the and through an interfaith, I believe, that you'd mentioned, encounters or was through its own kind of activism. So I think it's quite a sound decision that you made to meet Gulen afterwards. So I mean, one of the other questions we've got is, does a non-Muslim, non-Turk writing this book have an impact on the content? I mean, I know you tried to focus on studying Gulen's life objectively, and you do that through time frames, which I find very interesting, and it's definitely unique.
Thank you.
Does your background have an impact on the content, or perhaps what you decided to focus on whilst writing the book?
Yes, of course. No one is a completely objective observer. We all bring our point of view and our biases and our experiences with us when we write. I did write the book, primarily for 2 audiences, I think it would be fair to say. The first would be people who have heard of Gulen, who are familiar with Gulen, who are aware of Gulen, but have never really read anything by Gulen or heard him preach or teach. And so that would be, audiences in all over Europe, Africa, Australia, the United States, English-speaking folks who were curious but did not have access to the primary sources. And the second audience would be for, people inspired by Mr. Gulen, who themselves may have a different perspective or point of view, or may not have read or known the full scope of his life from its inception to the present day. And so for the first audience, I think it's fair to say, yes, I brought a great deal of Christian perspective and could see very clear parallels, and I drew parallels for Christian and Jewish readers especially. For the second audience, I think the fact that I bring a different point of view from the United States and as an English speaker and as a Christian also can provide some trajectories from Mr. Gulen's thinking for the present and future that can help people who are inspired by Mr. Gulen to see themselves and the community in some new ways. At least that was my hope and my intention. And from what I've heard from some people anyway, that second one has helped, has worked. People have told me that they've understood Hizmet and Mr. Gülen in some new ways as a result of reading my book. And that's, of course, a very, that's wonderful to hear from people, that your intention has actually eventuated and made a difference. So grateful for that. But yes, absolutely, my perspective mattered a great deal in writing the book. And I hope, one last thing on this, it's a great question. I hope that, and I believe that through writing this book, I've become a better Christian. In other words, I understand things about my own faith and practice that I would not have known if it were not for Mr. Gulen and the teachings of the Hizmet community. For instance, prayer beads, tesbih. I did a series with my the children in my congregation in Green Bay, where I talked about the different ways different communities use prayer beads. You know, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, and Christians share this particular mode of prayer and concentration. And that's just one of many examples of the kinds of interfaces I have discovered through my research.
I mean, being in, you know, the second audience that you mentioned, especially as, you know, kind of British-born person who would identify with the values of the Hizmet movement, your book was definitely inspiring for me in the sense that I was reading a lot of what, you know, Gulen had lived through in Turkey, especially in terms of dialogue, because that's where I find my passion. And thinking, you know, all of this happened before I was born. And I was like, you know, and of course, you know, I'm familiar with the movement in my own setting and what I can see and what I've heard, but I think Gulen's own life is perhaps within the movement kind of known from and through his sermons in Turkey, and, you know, later where he continued them. But very little is known in terms of the dialogue work that was done in Turkey, which in my opinion was kind of revolutionary. And I've been reading a lot of how Gulen theologized dialogue, and, you know, sees dialogue as a principle of Islam and an extension of Islam itself. So for me, you know, that dynamic itself is revolutionary, and I've gained a new passion for dialogue itself when viewed from that lens, and that is definitely, you know, due to your contribution in part as well. So thank you. I'm another one your fans of the book. But yeah, I definitely agree with your comments.
Thank you. You know, what I lifted up is, I think, a real seed of peace building. You know, it's not just dialogue for the sake of dialogue, it's dialogue for the sake of a more just and peaceful world. And so in that sense, the way you described it is exactly right. Dialogue emerges out of our deepest commitments, not as a way to water them down or as a way to find least common denominators, but precisely, you know, because we take living for God's pleasure seriously, that means we see, you know, God's presence in the other, and seek to enhance that part of their life and our own life through the process as well. So, you know, this isn't about conversion or about, you know, all becoming Muslim or all becoming Christian. It's about becoming better Christians and better Muslims and better citizens of wherever we happen to reside, so that we can bring our strongest gifts, our deepest gifts from God, to service in public life. And I think that is what I describe in the book as principled pluralism. In other words, it's not pluralism just for the sake of diversity. It's pluralism that is engaged in a principled fashion, and through dialogue, through cooperation, through working together, to solve the problems that we face as societies. You know, Mr. Gulen, following Said Nursi, identifies those three problems in particular: ignorance, poverty, and disunity or violence. And there's plenty of work for us to do. is still in relationship to those three problems, right?
Mm-hmm. I mean, just in kind of extension of what you said, you know, those being kind of benefits of dialogue, but I also think seeing the parallels between, you know, Christianity and Islam itself for me, and this, you know, despite me growing up in this Christian school, I've been through education. I think I'd never really caught the depth of the parallels in belief. I mean, I kind of thought it as, you know, Christians believe in one God and then Muslims believe in one God, but through dialogue, there's honestly a lot more depth in that. You know, the manifestation of God's kind of, you know, in an Islamic term, you'd say, you know, his 99 names or perhaps his attributes in humanity, and that itself being a kind of joint belief and understanding that's shared. I think, you know, recognition of that itself can just stimulate so much discussion and a construction for the betterment of the world. So yeah, I'm just kind of sharing my passion for dialogue here, but I genuinely do see it as a revolutionary tool itself.
Yes, a nonviolent revolution, absolutely. And if I can build on what you said as well, I mean, I'm enjoying our conversation. You bring to it thoughtfulness and insight, and I'm grateful for that. The historian Max Mueller, who was one of the founders of the discipline of the history of religions, once said, "Whoever knows one religion knows none. Whoever knows one religion knows none," because the world is large, right? And there are lots of ways to make one's way through the world. And to imagine that only your one narrow way is the only way is to misrepresent the very nature of reality. You know, God made us different so that we can know each other. And to me, that's one of the most you know, powerful ideas in the Quran, is that difference is woven into the very fabric of God's creation. And God's way of being, and even God's vision for us as well. So, yeah, whoever knows one religion knows none, and that then is you know, as part of our religious faith, our tradition, we engage in dialogue. Yeah, as a very central aspect of who we are.
Yeah, and I mean, I really do want to go into the content of the book, but just to
Sure.
onto what you've said. You know, it's, I mean, like you said, you know, a peaceful revolution in itself. It's honestly, I think that such a vision and so many parallels and in a kind of unifying sense could be found. So even, you know, plurality within one religion itself
Yes.
is something that you can look at. And I mean, before my own kind of personal encounters with the movement, my Islamic knowledge was built from a lot of Googling, and unfortunately the world of Google isn't very formed. It can be a place where kind of more narrow-minded people can spread their ideologies and religions very, very kind of fast, I guess. So this idea of diversity being intended, I think it is at the core of both faiths, but for Muslims to recognize this, I think in the 21st century, especially with a lot of things that are going on for the Muslim world, is revolutionary itself for a Muslim. I kind of speak on behalf of community. You know, the idea that diversity is intended and God created humanity diverse on purpose, and there's some conscious understanding there, is necessary.
And yet, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to go into the topic of the book, but if you have anything
Sure.
to add.
Well, I mean, you know, it's a paradox, right? I mean, diversity and unity held in balance or harmony is the goal. I mean, we don't want to lose that sense of tawheed, that unity that is crucial, that flows to us from the oneness of God and from the teachings of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But at the same time, you know, while the community can be strong, we can also reach out to others. And in fact, in some ways, the stronger the community is, the more we will reach out to others for dialogue. All right, to the book.
Okay,
yes.
To the book. I mean, I want to touch upon the themes that you mentioned, but just before, I mean, the kind of title of the book I think was very interesting. You know, A Life of Hizmet. You've got here Gulen, who dedicated his life to Hizmet, but also your book kind of follows a life of the making of Gulen, if we can kind of frame it in that way, from Erzurum to Izmir to Istanbul to you know, the world, and kind of the changes that Gulen experiences through the different environments that he's kind of put into and experiences, and the Hizmet identity, to which now, you know, hundreds of thousands, if not perhaps millions of people across the globe identify, whether or not, in some sense. I think that was an interesting way to frame the book. It's not a standard biography. It's not, you know, he was born here, his family was this, he experiences it. It's really constructing Gulen's identity around places and then what emerged from those places, which I think was very, very insightful and a very talented way of pulling a biography together. I mean, you touch upon 5 themes, the first being kind of non-violence as a practice of Islam, you know, principle of pluralism, which you touched upon, engaged empathy, spiritual and scientific literacy, and Hizmet as a kind of social enterprise. So you touch upon these themes, and these were things that we discussed when we had our book club on the book. I just want to see if there are any questions coming from the audience. I think I've got a...
There's one that I saw.
Yes. Perhaps we could leave that, or should we go for that one now? I mean, do you want to take the question?
Sure, I'll address the question, and then maybe can speak to the sort of why I wrote the book the way I wrote it. How's that? So the question is, have you met with any other Christians who've also said that reading the book made them better Christians? I don't know if they put it that way, but I have heard a great deal of appreciation from other Christians who've read the book and who said it helped them understand under Mr. Gülen better, and who gave them perspectives on the Hizmet movement. I mean, you know, I didn't write the book to make better Christians, I guess would be one way to put it. I really wanted people to understand Mr. Gülen, but I'm in my own life, the research that I did certainly deepened my own engagement and understanding of Christianity, and I hope that it did that for other people. You know, when I wrote the book, I knew I could not write a standard biography. I did not have the facility with Turkish, and I didn't have access to the kind of documents, especially the government documents, that really would have been crucial for me to write the kind of detailed day-to-day biography, and, you know, digging into the documents, the correspondence about his various trials. And, you know, somebody else will write that biography someday. And mine just set the stage for it. So I think, as I say in the book, you know, I really had sort of 4 aims. You know, first was to write the biography in a way that was accurate. I mean, the details I could find, I wanted to be fair, accurate, based on the evidence. The second thing that the book, I hope, does is show how Gulen inspired many other people, hundreds of thousands, millions, to Hizmet, to follow his commitment to service. Third, and this is especially for the first audience I mentioned to you, the English speakers who aren't Muslims, who aren't Turks, I hope the book would be at some level an introduction to Islam. That is a way to overcome some of the disinformation that has circulated about Islam, some of the intentional creation of enemies out of Muslims associated with Islamophobia, and with unfortunately some of U.S. and the UK's adventures in politics in the Middle East. I could speak about that more if we wanted to. So that would be the third, you know, aim of the book, that sort of introduction to authentic Islam, peace-building Islam, Islam as peace. And then Fourth is really that other aim, to show how our religious traditions at their best contribute to a more just and peaceful world. And so each of those five themes that you mentioned, learning, nonviolent practices, engaged empathy, principled pluralism, and social enterprise, each of those five themes is what I call a seed of peace. So I think about peace not as the construction of a building, but much more as the growing of a garden. And so peace is organic. It emerges from the ground up. And it has these different elements, these different seeds that we can see in our religious traditions and that have been cultivated over millennia, right? I mean, we think of nations as durable things, right? But most of them, a few hundred years. In the case of the United States, okay, we go back to 1776, big deal. Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism, Taoism, I mean, the millennia, right? And I think as human beings, as scholars, as citizens, we have not paid attention to why those traditions have been so durable. And it is my conviction, my belief, and I believe the evidence demonstrates that the reason our religious traditions have endured for millennia is because they bring people peace, individually, and then in groups as well. Now, the challenge ahead of us is to get out of those silos of peace building, or out of those little garden plots of peace building, and really generate peace across the globe, bringing together the wisdom of our diverse traditions in cooperative ways to care for this great, beautiful planet that we have, the only one we have. And that means organizing and engaging with passion and compassion to address the central problems facing us: ignorance, poverty, disunity, and I would add, woven through all of those is caring for the planet and sustaining our ways of life together. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you for kind of touching or answering the question. We have got a couple of more coming through, but I think I'll start with the learning theme of the book, and then perhaps we can weave the questions in as we go along. So learning, then you touch upon his life in Erzurum and Edirne from 1938 to 1966, and quote as learning leads, in education being a common tongue. I mean, that a few comments in the book, which I think were good because they were contributions from people who have experienced learning, perhaps. So we have Miss Emine Eroğlu who say
really.
Yeah, she's a lot of people's favorite. Yes. Reaction when I talk to her, so I'll be sure to share your reaction in this with her afterwards.
Please do. It was a lovely interview, and I'm so glad she's included in the book.
Yeah. So her quote is, "I have witnessed how Hizmet helps people to bring out their inner beauty. The work was done through non-violence, without hands against those strike you, without speech against those who curse you, as a jihad." So on the theme of a greater jihad in Islam, and her own experience in the 1980s, going abroad for her part in Hizmet and in Hijret, I guess we could say as well.
Yes.
So can you say that learning leads to Hizmet, and that there's a few things of learning. There's the kind of educational learning, but there's the learning of non-violence and the role that these institutions play in societies. So could you kind of open up what you mean by what does learning leads to Hizmet mean? What does Hizmet mean, perhaps, in your understanding?
Sure. The metaphor that I really like from Mr. Gulen is that we have to fly with two wings. And that metaphor of flying with two wings means we avoid dualisms. That is, we avoid the easy bifurcations of us versus them, or of science versus religion, or of fact versus value that the world unfortunately has imposed. And that also means, we have to avoid the bifurcation of the natural world from the spiritual world. In other words, we need to hold together these tensions and incorporate the best from both. So to take the science religion distinction, for instance, I'm paraphrasing here something I quoted from Mr. Gulen, that, science without no, religion without science leads towards superstition and fanaticism, and science without religion leads to a reductive materialism that has proven to be extraordinarily destructive to the planet. And so we really need to hold together both scientific inquiry, that is, the best of our reasoning capabilities based on evidence and, using verification and falsification, while at the same time, we also incorporate the teachings of nonviolence that are found, those seeds of peace, again, across our historic religious traditions, that deep ancient wisdom of our ancestors that we disregard at our peril. Following up on this, I think this is the place in particular, one of the questions I see is, does your book also have good messages for atheists? Yes, I hope so. Anyway, and this is one of the ways that people who are spiritual and who are secular, or who are theists or who are atheists, can work together. We can learn from one another, and in some ways the most the richest dialogues are those that are across the greatest differences. And the people who have the greatest disagreements with us are often the people we can learn the most from. So learning is at best is flying with two wings, and that's across domains and across disciplines, as I see it.
This is just the question that's kind of just popped into my mind. I mean, Gulen quoting what you about science and religion, I'm assuming is inspired from Said Nursi's work and his attempt. And I'm just looking at one of the other quotes that I've kind of taken from that section from Eyüp Tunver, I believe. Gulen changed our minds about girls. They are important for our future. I think that girls are more intelligent than boys if given the opportunity. And that's kind of on the topic of equality of education as well. And how Hizmet kind of worked on perhaps inspiring that. To go back to the question, do you know if Gulen was familiar with the work during this time in his life? Like, do you know when he was familiarized with that work?
Yeah, I mean, from what I can tell, I mean, it's not definitive, and this is one of the things I could have asked Mr. Gulen, I suppose, as I was writing the book, if I had chosen that approach. But from what I can tell, I believe he first became familiar with Nursi in the 1950s, 1953, roughly. So when he was still quite young, and began reading him in earnest. And then has continued that process, of course, throughout his life. He continues to learn from the Risale-i Nur and from the entire corpus of Nursi's writings. So yes, absolutely, that legacy is crucial. And whoever it is who writes the definitive biography of Fetullah Gülen someday will also have to become a scholar of Said Nursi. Don't question about that. That would be a crucial element in that deeper biography that will someday come, or those biographies that will someday come out.
I mean, I think just kind of extended on what you say, and perhaps, imagining the extension of your book. If, for example, there was a kind of a section to be written perhaps on, the post-coup Hizmet movement, for example, in thematically following your structure. What Gulen is kind of mentioning in his Turkish sermons at the moment is a rereading of the Risale-i Nur. He's asking, those who are inspired by the movement to go back to it and to kind of read it, and perhaps, find, because a lot of people from the Hizmet movement are the language of the Risale-i Nur very difficult. It's written in this kind of, I mean, side Nursi being Kurdish, his grammatical structuring of Turkish sentences is difficult, and the languages that he's using is kind of an older form of Turkish. So a lot of people are struggling, but he's, you know, consistently asking his followers to kind of reread it and perhaps reevaluate it to today's society.
Sure.
So I definitely that the Risale-i plays a kind of pivotal role in his thought. I just want to skim through the questions. I don't know if you, I think some of them we've only got 20 minutes left, but I'm actually thoroughly enjoying this discussion. I think we can leave these to the end because they're kind of about Hizmet in a more wider sense. So after 66, our book takes us on a journey to Izmir, which is a beautiful city itself. And here you kind of talk about, I mean, you mentioned before, this kind of a continuation of political tensions in Turkey. And this is especially kind of amongst the youth. But during this time, Gülen's thought kind of, it turns inwards perhaps. And he does this from some perspective, I guess you could say. I mean, so you touched on zakat and how it could equate to, you know, organizing of a mutavelli, kind of the of business donate, or you touch upon Ramadan and fasting as kind of a spiritual awakening, and you know how Ramadan then personified by Gulen. And you talk about Hajj and Hijrah, and during this period there's a discussion of taking Hizmet to places where there is no Hizmet, as that. And yeah, I mean, there's a quote from, I think it was Ismail Büyükçelebi, I'm just looking at my notes, but he says, I have never prayed like this in my life. For a prayer he engages with Gülen. So I think this chapter is nice for kind of bringing Islamic values into the discussion as well, and things that are kind of pivotal for Muslim understanding. So I perhaps see as that kind of an effort of yours in this chapter to explain Islam through Hizmet, perhaps.
Yep.
I'd like to kind of elaborate.
Very much so. You read me well. The effort here is to take the 5 pillars of Islam, and through Hoca Efendi's teachings, and then through what has happened in the Hizmet community, the Hizmet movement since then, to give an accurate perception of the non-violent heart of Islam. So, you know, the point of this chapter is that prayer and fasting and pilgrimage and the other, you know, non-violent practices of Islam are part of peace building. And to clarify that for readers, by touching down with Mr. Gulen's teaching, which of course reinforced the theme of nonviolence in a very conflicted time in Turkey, of course, and sort of to contrast Mr. Gulen's teaching about nonviolence and about peace building with the politicization that was occurring in Turkey during these years, you know, the fights in the streets, and, you know, many of the interviews that I did, not so much with Mr. Büyükçelebi, but with some other of the individuals who were close to him very early, you know, point this out, and I tell their stories in that chapter about these youth who were taken from being fighters, you know, street fighters, to instead being activists on behalf of education. In this chapter, pretty much everything associated with Hizmet down to today has its beginnings. I mean, it was really in this period that the initiatives began to grow. So this chapter is very important one, both in his biography. You know, he said about Izmir, I'm going to drown there, right? I mean, he was worried as a young man coming from a small, very tiny, poor town, right? Going to Izmir? I mean, you know, it was terrifying. And yet, of course, he flourished. And it must have been very gratifying for him personally to realize these blessings of God through the work that he was doing. including during this period taking his first pilgrimage as well, which changed him. And so you begin to see in this chapter also some of Mr. Gulen's evolution as he grows as a theologian, as a scholar, as a teacher, as a Muslim, as a person. And you see his influence beginning to grow as well during this time period. And it's important to point out, I think, that his emphasis on equalities for women was always there, even though in practice, Hizmet hasn't always kept up with his vision of equality in its own implementation, right? And I think it's in a later chapter when I interviewed, Sevgi Akarcheshme about how, given the patriarchy of Turkish society and given, patriarchy around the globe as well, what Hizmet has done is nothing short of miraculous. That is, taking people who were patriarchal and parochial and turning them into activists for dialogue and believers in equality. However, that plays itself out. I mean, there are lots of different ways to encourage equality. It's not of just one flavor, in other words.
Yeah, I mean, just kind of sweeping on the topic of patriarchy and gender into your next chapter, which touches on concepts of empathy and tears. From the 70s to the 80s in Gülen's life, and how for in Turkey and amongst that conflict that's going on, this kind of I think it would be fair to say kind of an elevated kind of toxic masculinity which is kind of permanent. You have, I'm just going to read from one of the quotes from Ahmet Tekin. When Hoca Efendi would start praying, there would be an orchestra of crying, and you see this increased presence of male university students attending the mosque sermons. Hoca Efendi would cry every time he'd mention Allah, or perhaps the Prophet. We could extend that too, and you can see those in his sermons, which are available. And I think it's something that the people, even perhaps today, movement can are still impacted by. And this time I think is kind of critical for Gulen in the sense that I think he begins to live dialogue. And there's a series of assassinations, and that there's the discussion amongst Islamists of killing all communists, and amongst the the far rights, vice versa. And this is during this period where Gulen kind of theologizes perhaps this idea of there being a golden generation, there being a community. Which has empathy with science, religion, with in cohesion together. And one of the kind of examples I was touched by during this part of your book is one of the young men in the mosque saying that we should go and kill communists, and his neighbor in the mosque saying if you had done that yesterday, I would not be sitting with you today. And I think that kind of removes the radicalization there. I mean, there's some dialogue happening even within the mosque, and that builds bridges. And I think perhaps Gulen, seeing that, realizes the importance of engaging with perhaps people who the day before you could have wanted to kill, recognizing through lived experience that isn't how the world should be.
Yeah, I mean, the theme of it, thank you, that's beautifully said. I mean, the theme of the chapter is engaged empathy. Put into Christian terms, this means love your enemies, right? Recognize the humanity even of those with whom you most strongly disagree. And that's the most difficult of Jesus's teachings, to my mind. And it's also the one that Mr. Gulen, through his preaching and his teaching and his example, put into practice in a very conflicted situation in Turkey. Absolutely. Brutal political violence, organized crime gangs, political factions. And he was able to help people recognize how Islam didn't take sides in these debates, but in fact transcended them and developed, following the sort of Sufi ideal of al-insan al-kamil, the perfect human, the golden generation, this elevated vision of goodness, truth, and beauty for humanity that goes back even to Plato and his triad. So the idea of engaged empathy means you have to feel the deep suffering of the world. And I think that's what his tears communicated to people, allowed people, and you're absolutely right, toxic masculine types, to cry in public, right? And to feel this deep suffering of the world, which of course, as the Buddha teaches us, is the first noble truth. Life is suffering. You have to recognize that reality, but then do something about it as well. And that's where the engaged empathy came into effect. The first schools get developed during these years, and you begin to see practical applications of this kind of teaching in public life. So beyond, and the same thing was happening, interestingly, with Buddhism right around the same time, coming out of Vietnam. So during the Vietnam War, it was a peace builder by the name of Thich Nhat Hanh, who went on to participate in the Paris Peace Accords and then establish Plum Village communities for engaged Buddhism. I mean, that's what his movement became known as. And my familiarity with that kind of peace building informed the way I wrote this chapter and helped me understand what was happening in these tears. And then set a trajectory to show how that empathy then was put into practice in practical ways in the world.
Thank you. I mean, still in the unfortunate kind of political conflict in Turkey, the next section of the book takes us to Istanbul between 1980 and 1999. And this section is called, Melancholy and Dialogue. And the post-coup Istanbul isn't as friendly as perhaps people had hoped, and Gulen's being accused of being some sort of an antichrist, trying to bring Sharia to Turkey and kind of Islamize the politics in Turkey itself. So he goes through a period of hiding in plain sight, occasionally visiting Erzurum. But I think you touch upon how dialogue is kind of emerging from Glenn's experiences of perhaps being in the spotlight for something that he doesn't identify with, and there's a quote from him in the book: "If our aim is to attain peace through goodness and beauty, hope and security, our work must begin with the individual." So there's a sort of large group persecution going on, but Gulen kind of brings it back to peace and working with the individual. This is one of your largest chapters in the book, and we do try and keep this to an hour, so I've got 10 minutes left. So I mean, I have 20 slides. I think I'm in the first few still. To kind of wrap this one up, you mentioned the concept of hoşgörü in this section. How would you define it, and how do you think it shapes dialogue? And perhaps could you bring in some experiences of Gülens during this period and how it shapes his understanding?
Well, I think you put it exactly right, and I can be fairly brief. We've already talked about principal pluralism as a practical expression or a way to describe hoşgörü. But finally, it has a theological component. And this is where, Dr. Scott Alexander really helped me. We were at a conference in Accra, Ghana, that brought together for the first time Muslims, Christians, and practitioners of indigenous religions. And Scott talked about hoşgörü and its meaning theologically. It's a compound term to see nicely, right? But he said it really means to see others as God sees them. And that means to see others with eyes of mercy and compassion. And it is that spirit of hoşgörü that then led to these many initiatives, starting with the events in Istanbul in the 1990s, where Mr. Gülen talked about hoşgörü and made the concept familiar to people across political and religious persuasions in Turkey: Christians, Jews, Muslims, atheists, Islamists, you name it. Everybody was at the table, literally, at this event. And what followed from that, of course, were the Avant platforms. Previously, the Journalist and Writers Foundation had been founded, and so you had the media agencies underway as well. So all of these practical ways that the spirit of dialogue was put into practice in real life was terribly exciting to see as a historian, to begin to realize, how these ideas were taking, these seeds of peace were being planted and were growing and producing fruit. I mean, it really was, the whole project was an exceptionally exciting project to work on, simply because of the rapidity of the scale of change. I mean, one life making this huge difference in the globe. I mean, it should be incredibly encouraging to anyone, right? Inspiring to anyone, that one life matters, right? Anyway, sermon over. Okay, homily done for today. We could move on to chapter 5 in social enterprise.
Yeah, I'm just kind of just looking through my notes, seeing if there's anything that I want to pick up on. And this chapter in the book was definitely, I mean, we had the discussion at the beginning on how critical dialogue is. This section, for me, I think the examples, especially, I'd mentioned a lot before I was born, and the dialogue with Christians, for example. I mean, I'm somewhat familiar with a kind of, and how correct it is to say this, I don't know, kind of overwhelming, the Turkish perspective to non-Muslims. I mean, how critical the Islamic identity, although the state is not secular itself, that the being Muslim is kind of critical, and a Sunni Muslim specifically, to the Turkish identity. The Journalist and Writers Foundation was extremely important. Meeting with Pope John II in 1998. But for Gulen to continue that meeting in private, and continue that dialogue with private letters, showing that, it wasn't merely some sort of a PR campaign to kind of give himself a good name, and for someone in Turkey was I've used the word revolutionary quite a bit, but it was at that time,
Well, and he paid a cost for it as well. I mean, that there were people who were and are still deeply anti-Semitic in Turkey, and that can be stoked. The fact of the matter is, having an enemy helps organize societies, and unfortunately, the current regime in Turkey has done that extremely effectively by scapegoating Mr. Gülen and people inspired by him in ways that are truly tragic. And we have 5 minutes left here. I had to say that, right, in order to point to the importance of empathy again, and how dialogue, or how Mr. Gülen's life shows the resilience of Islam, that despite this repeated government effort to suppress, not just once in his life, 5 times he's experienced this, right? Every time Hizmet grew stronger. And we see that happening now in the diaspora, as individuals like you, right, are carrying the mantle for the next generation and for generations to come of Islam. I just think it's really breathtaking and beautiful as an example of how love is stronger than fear, of how love is a greater power than political force and dominance. Because finally, that is what it comes down to, is that power of love that Mr. Gulen has written about in the tradition of Rumi, right? And, in that honest appreciation of the greater jihad, as you put it earlier.
I mean, I'm just going to mention them in passing and hopefully somehow wrap up in a minute and get to the question. The advocacy for women's rights, and that was the 1995, and something kind of very, very perhaps tough to talk about in the Turkey context of, including and reaching out to the Kurdish citizens of Turkey.
Yep.
Racism as being the age's most severest problem, and this is still early on when in Turkey. And then you move on to Gulen moving to Pennsylvania, which is kind of giving the movement a sort of footprint, and then inspiring others to move as well to other countries. Hizmet in Europe in 1989 actually, and this is when people are asked to make
So yeah, we have 3 minutes here for the chapter, which in some ways is the most important because it points us beyond another one of those dualisms, beyond capitalism and communism, or beyond individual acquisition and corporate or collective good. And so the model here is, istishara, and the emphasis on mutual consultation as kind of the DNA of Hizmet and Mr. Gülen's own life. In other words, the wisest person is the one who listens most to others and takes their perspectives into view and doesn't imagine that one has all of the answers. It's sort of, a Socratic approach. And I think that's puts itself into practice in the kind of businesses and financial operations associated with Hizmet as well. In other words, there's a vision of the common good in accord with the kind of teachings associated with people like Muhammad Yunus of Grameen Bank and social business or social enterprise. In other words, the gathering of wealth, the collection of wealth exists, of course, to take care of one's own family, but also to contribute to the common good, to solving the social problems that exist. And so there becomes then what Robert Reich, the economist, calls a virtuous cycle that sets up where people develop greater trust in each other and share more resources, and then those resources are oriented and organized toward the common good. And that again comes right out of Islamic teaching, and yet applied in a new way that could be really important for the world through the example of Mr. Gülen and Hizmet.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I mean, that is a nice way to kind of end the discussion, just to kind of on the topic of istishara as well. I mean, you mentioned that in the context of Gulen's views on democracy, which is also a necessary kind of point to touch upon. As someone who's been accused of being an Islamist, actually him holding this kind of Islamic mechanism as kind of somehow trying to form a theology for democracy within an Islamic framework as being critical. I mean, we haven't been able to touch upon the questions, but there are several there. I mean, I don't know if you've had a chance to look at them. There's perhaps one that you'd like to pick up, or we can wrap up as
so what is the biggest challenge you see for the Gulen and Hizmet movement in these days? Obviously there are huge just practical difficulties of refugee status, of people in prison, people being silenced within Turkey and around the globe. So that but internally, I think the bigger challenges would be to continue the Musbat Harakat, the positive action that is really at the heart of Mr. Gülen's vision. That is not to react to the political power structures, but to work insofar as possible to even convert them. And that's an easy thing for me to say sitting here in my comfortable office in Wisconsin. It's much more difficult to put into practice when you are on the ground, when you are being detained, when you have had to move halfway around the world. And yet, it seems to me this is vital, is to keep that positive action, that is, don't react to the evil, but continue to act in ways that are consistent with God's greater pleasure.
Thank you very much.
It was really wonderful to talk with you. You asked very good questions, and you were a careful reader of my book. I'd love to keep in touch if that would be a possibility.
Of course, of course. I mean, you have my email.
Okay.
It benefited hugely, both in, you know, in kind of academic sense, and also in my own understanding and self, and also with others. So I'd like to thank you for firstly writing the book, and also for, you know, dedicating some time in your busy schedule to be with us. It's tonight here, but I think afternoon in Wisconsin.
Yes, yes, and I have another meeting coming up that started 2 minutes ago. But and know this, know this for everyone. I will be your advocates, and if I can write letters of recommendation, if I can read things you've written, if I can be of help to any of you in your ongoing vocations, know that that is my commitment, and don't hesitate to reach out to me, okay?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Peace. Salam. Ramadan Mubarak.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.